Graham Ike should have been WCC Player of the Year last year, a wrong that will be righted this season.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Happy Tuesday, and welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you by FanDuel. Folks, place your first $5 bet, and you will get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Just visit FanDuel.com today to get started. Well, folks, we are continuing our player preview series today. We're talking about every player on Gonzaga's roster. We're talking about their history, how they ended up here in Spokane. We're also talking about their best and worst case scenarios for this upcoming season. And then we're closing out the show talking about their expected role this year, their future in Spokane, if they have years of eligibility left. And then we'll also talk about their NBA or professional aspirations as well. We got 3 of these left, including today's. Today, we're talking Graham Ike. We'll talk Nolan Hickman later in the week. And then next week, after the games start, we're going to do another one where we're going to wrap up with the final few players all in one episode before we get done with this series. But today, we talked the big fella in the middle, Graham Ike. Ike's career did not get off to He was not a highly regarded prospect out of high school. He's from Aurora, Colorado. He suffered an injury in high school, missed a huge chunk of his high school career, was a 0-star prospect according to 247 Sports, so was not a regarded prospect really in any way coming out of high school. But he did have some offers. He had offers from LMU. He had offers from Air Force, offer from Akron, from Bucknell, a couple other schools in the mix as well, including Jeff Linder's Wyoming Cowboys, which is where Graham ultimately ended up starting his collegiate career in the 2020-21 season. And he didn't start his career on time. As we said, he had that injury at the end of his high school career. It lingered into the start of his college basketball career. He did not begin playing for Wyoming in that season until January of 2021. He didn't make his debut until the 22nd of January and played in 12 games, starting 7 of them for that Wyoming team, played about 21 and a half minutes per game. He had good stats, though, in those 12 games that he played, 11 points, 5 boards, shot about 61% from 2, and he made an impact right away. His first game was against Nevada, and he played okay in that game. And then his second game was also against Nevada. And in that game, he had 18 points and 6 rebounds on 7 of 10 shooting. So in the second game of Graham Ike's college career, he immediately proved that he belonged on the floor at the time, a quality Mountain West program in Wyoming against a quality team in Nevada. And he had a great game there. He also, in the Mountain West Conference tournament against Wyoming, again, this was his 11th game, I believe, that he played of his college basketball career against San Jose State. Ike had 32 points on 12 of 14 shooting. This man established himself as a really good get for Coach Linder in Wyoming immediately, 11 games into his career, and he's proving that he definitely deserved to have more than 0 stars next to his name coming out of high school. And his sophomore season, that's when he exploded. That's when he became the player that we know him as now for the Gonzaga Bulldogs. In his second season, he made 33 starts for Wyoming, played about 32 minutes per game, and put up monstrous numbers, 19 and a half points a game, 9.6 rebounds, 1.3 assists. Wasn't as efficient of a scorer because he had a huge usage rate. It was about 51.5% on 2-pointers, about 72% from the free throw line, but he was an all Mountain West player. He had scored in double figures in 32 of his 33 games. Literally scored 10 or more points in all but one game. And the one game he didn't, he scored 8. Just a tremendous, balanced, really, really excellent season for Graham Ike for Wyoming back in the 21-22 season. He scored 20 or more points in 15 of Wyoming's 33 games. He scored 25 or more points in 9 of their 33 games. He also had 14 double-doubles. And it would have been 15 because in the game that he scored 8 points, the one game he didn't score in double figures, he had more than 10 rebounds in that game. Then Graham Ike missed the entire next season. He was pegged as the preseason Mountain West Player of the Year. And unfortunately, the leg injury never allowed him to return for Wyoming. He did not play at all in the 22-23 season. After that season, he enters the transfer portal, ends up committing to Mark Few and the Gonzaga Bulldogs alongside Ryan Nembhard, giving Gonzaga their new starting point guard and their new starting center on the same day. Just shortly after Steele Venters committed, it looked like the Zags were adding 3 starters in the span of about a week. Of course, we know that Steele Venters, unfortunately, was unable to suit up last year or will be unable to suit up this year for Gonzaga due to injury issues. But then Graham comes in, and there was some concern of what's the injury going to be like? Is he going to be fully healthy? Is he going to be able to, even if he is healthy, he missed an entire year. Like, when is he going to shake the rust off? And there was a little bit of rust early in Graham Ike's Gonzaga career, but not dramatically. He started out his Gonzaga basketball career good, and then he just got better as the season went on. All told, he started 35 games for Gonzaga, played 24 minutes per game, finished the season with averages of 16.5 points, 7.5 rebounds, just under 1 assist, and 0.7 blocks per game. Shot a career high 62.2% on twos, a career high 36.8% from 3. That was 7 of 19, and a career high 78.4% from the free throw line, far and away the best mark of his career from the charity stripe. He was all WCC, but he was not named Player of the Year. That, of course, went to Augustus Marciulionis from St. Mary's, much to the chagrin of many Gonzaga fans out there who felt that he deserved that award. And we talked a lot during these player preview episodes about kind of the turning point of the season. And for most players, or for a lot of players who had that turning point, it was when Gonzaga changed their starting lineup, when Ben Gregg entered the lineup in place of Dusty Stromer. Obviously, that acted as a big catalyst for those two players to have their season kind of changed, but it also had an impact on Ryan Nembhard. It had an impact on some of the other players on the roster as well. Graham's starting point, or his turning point, happened a little earlier in the year. There's good quotes about it. Mark Few said it, and Graham kind of confirmed it, that they had a conversation at the San Diego State game of like, yeah, we need you to demand the ball. Like, the part of the Gonzaga experience in the front court is you are a high usage player. You demand the basketball. You fight for position constantly. We get you the rock. You get in positions to score. Gonzaga's offense is predicated and built around a high usage big. Part of the reason Gonzaga was interested in Graham Ike is because he'd fulfilled the role of being a high usage big at Wyoming. So in the early part of the season, it's not that he was bad, but he wasn't quite filling that role the way that the staff wanted him to. And you can see a pretty big shift in his season right around that point. In the first 11 games of the season for Graham Ike last year, he averaged 13.5 points, 7.6 rebounds, and 22 minutes per game. That's not bad at all. In those 11 games, he averaged 9.3 field goal attempts per game. But after that, for the final 24 games that Graham played last year in a Gonzaga uniform, he averaged 17.9 points, 7.3 rebounds, so not much of a change there, in 25 minutes per game. So 3 more minutes per game, but about 5.5 more points per game. And that came with an increase in field goal attempts per game from 9.3 to 11.6. We saw a player who was more assertive, who was more aggressive, demanding the basketball, who was hunting his shot more, who was more efficient when he had the ball in his hands. That was the version of Graham Ike that we needed for this team to turn things around. That, combined with the starting lineup change that brought Ben Gregg into the lineup and gave Gonzaga more size, combined with Ryan Nembhard finding his shot a little bit and Gonzaga switching up the way they were running the pick and roll offense, it created a much better version of this Gonzaga basketball team. And Graham had some huge performances, particularly down the stretch. He had 26 points and 7 rebounds, against Santa Clara on the 24th of February. He had exactly that same stat line, 26 points and 7 rebounds against San Francisco at the Chase Center on February 29th. And then at St. Mary's, the final regular season game of the season, a big game. Gonzaga kind of locked up being in an at-large bid in the NCAA tournament. With that win over San Francisco, but people felt like they really need to cement it by beating St. Mary's on the road. Graham Ike goes out, gets 24 and 10 against Mitchell Saxon, leads Gonzaga to a victory over St. Mary's. Huge, big-time performance, a strong game in that rivalry with St. Mary's. Graham also had 18 and 10 against Purdue in the NCAA tournament, a game that obviously people don't want to remember because Gonzaga lost and it ended their season, but 18 and 10 against Zach Edey and Purdue, tremendous performance. That's the final game we've seen from Graham Ike until, of course, the exhibition game, which we'll talk about a little bit later. I know he did not have a very strong performance against USC in that contest, but all told, it was an incredibly successful first season for Graham in Spokane. And now he comes into the year as a clear candidate to be WCC Player of the Year. But folks, he may not just stop there. Graham Ike is a real chance to be an All-American as well. We're going to talk about that as well as what his worst case scenario might look like this season, all coming up in just a second. But first, folks, it's time for our Roy Player of the Week. And yeah, it's the Graham Ike Player Preview episode, but we're actually showing some love to Ryan Nembhard as our Player of the Week. We're putting $100 on Nembhard right now through Roy, the ultimate platform where you get to directly support your favorite athletes. Download Roy on iOS or the Google Play Store. There's no middleman, no collective making the decisions for you. You decide who gets the backing, and it's as easy as just a few clicks. With Roy, you know exactly where your money's going. Roy gives you the power to decide who gets your support. Every contribution from fans like us helps keep the athletes committed to the team. And if they decide to transfer, you get your money back. How's that for transparency? So what are you waiting for? Download the Roy app today and make your contribution. Not only are you supporting the athlete's journey, but you're also helping keep the Zags strong for next season. Remember, if they stay, you win. And if they leave, no worries, you get your cash back. That wraps up our Roy Player of the Week segment. Don't forget, if you want to support more athletes and be part of their success stories, Roy is the way to go. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast, and we are still going through our player preview episode, talking all things Graham Ike today, doing our best and worst case scenarios here in the second segment. And for those of you who have listened to, I believe, the 6 or 7 of these that we have already done up to this point, you know the caveat. I'll go through it quickly here. We do these best case within reason, worst case without injury. What that means is we're not going to discuss injuries unless it's a relevant part of a player's history. So we will touch on it briefly with Graham Ike, and we're not going to talk best case and within reason, as in we're not going to talk about a player being the number 1 pick in the draft or an All-American unless that is within reason. Having said that, the best case scenario for Graham Ike is, in fact, that he is an All-American and that he is the WCC Player of the Year. We'll talk about how he gets there. The best case scenario for Graham Ike is that the aggressive version of Ike that we saw in my notes, I put in the second half, but really in the last 2/3 of the season, after that San Diego State game, the entire WCC slate in the NCAA tournament, that version of Graham Ike is what we see for a full season. He's comfortable having recovered from a surgery, which I think maybe could have led to some of his tentativeness. He's comfortable within his role as being in a new system and being with teammates who were also in a new system, some of them because they were new to Gonzaga, some of them because they were playing different roles, that none of those concerns that we saw early in the year are there. And because he's fully a full year removed from the injury, because he's now a full year within the system, that he just continues to be a force around the rim. That the 62% we saw him shoot on 2-pointers last year bumps up. That now he's 65, 68, pushes 70%. Because of his usage rate, I don't know that he'll actually get to 70, but 65+% as a 2-point scorer would be a fantastic addition to this Gonzaga team. A slight bump there would really help them out. The best case scenario for Graham Ike is that he remains a beast on the glass. Gets about 3 offensive rebounds per game. He was a solid offensive rebounder last year, but this year, let's see that tick up a little bit more. 7.5 boards per game, but again, at Wyoming, he was 9.6 in his 1 full season. Maybe we're closer to 8.5. Maybe we're closer to 9 rebounds this year. He's cleaning up on the glass on offense and on defense. He's a force around the rim offensively. His efficiency ticks up. And then the best case scenario for Graham Ike, continuing on offense, comes from him as a passer. And I think this is probably the biggest area of growth that I would like to see from Graham offensively, and that I think would boost Gonzaga. Him being a slightly better rebounder helps, but they also added a really big, great rebounder in Michael Ajayi. Him being a slightly more efficient scorer around the rim helps, but again, a few missed shots. If he's not that, a few extra missed shots, some of them are going to get cleaned up offensively anyway. But him improving as a passer changes the way teams are able to defend Gonzaga, and that is a huge addition, huge benefit to this program. Last year, Graham Ike averaged 0.9 assists and 1.6 turnovers. He was not a passer. Wyoming didn't have he was so much of the focal point offensively for Wyoming that he wasn't really, he never really developed the skills to be a passer. Gonzaga bigs almost always improve as passers the longer they're in this system. Players like Shemet Karnowski and Domantas Sabonis and Robert Sacre and Drew Timme and so on and so on and so on become good passers. A lot of those are players you think of as being good passers. Not many of them were right away. It takes time. It takes development to be a better passer. Last year, a lot of teams inexplicably chose not to double Graham Ike and defended him in single coverage while he just went to absolute work against them. This year, I suspect more teams are going to attempt to double him. And the best case scenario for Graham is that he knows how to get out of those situations. He can read the defense. He sees the double team coming. He knows where to pass the basketball. He gets people open looks. A flip of those numbers, something closer to 1.5 assists per game and 1 turnover. Frankly, I'm fine with him averaging about 1.6 turnovers per game. That's not a really big number for a player with his kind of usage rate, but I'd rather see the assists double. 2 assists and 1.5 turnovers is great. Going from 1 to 2 assists doesn't feel like a big deal, but it's enough of a difference that teams are going to be more hesitant about doubling him. And if they're just leaving him in single coverage, he's going to go to work like we saw him do last year. The best case scenario for Graham Ike is that he remains a well above average free throw shooter in that 78-80% range, and that 3-point percentage sticks around 37%. But maybe there's a little bit of an increase in volume. I'm okay with there not being an increase in volume. I don't think that this Gonzaga offense needs more Graham Ike three-pointers. A lot of it happened last year in the 2 games against Purdue. I think half of his three-point attempts, 10 of his 19 three-point attempts came in those 2 games against Purdue because they were trying to pull Zach Edey away from the rim. So realistically, there's a good chance that his three-point numbers drop this year in terms of attempts and potentially percentage. If he only takes 10 threes this year, I don't really care what his percentage is. I care if it's 0, I care if it's 10, but otherwise it just doesn't really matter all that much. But in a best case scenario, maybe we're talking about a guy who takes 35 threes instead of 19, and he still shoots 37%. Maybe he only takes 10, but he makes 5 of them. It's not a huge part of his offense. It's not a critical part of the storyline for Graham Ike this year, but it's something to monitor. The best case scenario for Graham Ike is that he makes significant strides defensively. This was a big area of concern for Gonzaga. This is a big area of concern for Graham Ike in particular. He needs to foul less. Graham Ike averaged 24 minutes per game last year, partly because I think Gonzaga was making sure that he was going to be okay coming off of a significant leg injury, but partly because he sat for huge chunks of the first half in many games because he picked up early fouls. He also sat for a huge chunk of second halves of games when Gonzaga was blowing teams out, but Gonzaga has less of those Ken Pom 300 teams in the non-conference for Graham to only play 18 minutes in those games. So the best case scenario for Graham Ike is that he plays 28 minutes per game instead of 24, and he's able to do that because he is healthy and also because he is limiting his foul issues. The best case scenario for Graham Ike is that his lateral mobility improves and he is able to be a better defender in pick and rolls, whether he's getting switched on to guys or he's just better at hedging those screens so that he doesn't have to defend guards in space, and he's better as a rim protector. He's not going to suddenly block 2.5 shots per game. That's not going to happen. He's never been a shot blocker at all. But he's better at using his body. He's better at avoiding fouls, as we've already alluded to. And he is just more impactful on that end of the floor than he was last year. What are the worst case scenarios for Graham Ike? Well, again, the injury factor is there. We don't know that there's any injury issues going on with him, but because it's a history, that would obviously be something to keep a very close eye on with Graham. Outside of that, the worst case scenario for Graham Ike is that he's inconsistent around the rim, and that the performance we saw against USC, where he shot 3 of 10 and was 1 of 8 until he made his last 2 attempts, we actually see more of that. I don't think that's super likely that he suddenly craters in his 2-point field goal percentage, but he did shoot 51.5% on twos in his full season at Wyoming and was 62% last year. That's a pretty big jump. A worst case scenario would be a bit of regression in that area. The bigger issue for Graham Ike, though, in a worst case scenario is an inability to pass out of the double team. The worst case scenario for Graham Ike effectively is that all teams or the majority of teams choose to double him as soon as he gets the basketball, and he is not better at making reads, at making quick decisions, at making passes to get out of the double team, and he's coughing the ball up a lot, and it's causing Gonzaga's offense to stagnate, and they ultimately can't give him the ball on the block as often as they would like to do, and they have to pivot and look for other ways to get their points offensively. The worst case scenario for Graham Ike is that he does not show improvement defensively. He continues to pick up too many fouls and forces himself on the bench early in the first half in multiple games and puts Gonzaga in a situation where their depth is tested in the front court, where Braden Huff is playing big minutes, and in certain situations that may not be a good thing. And either they're feeling like they got to play the freshman Ismaila Diani, or they got to go small with lineups where Ben Gregg is playing the 5 and Ajayi is playing the 4. And again, against certain teams that may work, but against good big men, if Graham Ike is getting in foul trouble against the likes of Mitchell Saxon or some of the other great bigs that Gonzaga is going to play this year, and Gonzaga's forced to go small, that could be a problem for them going forward. The worst case scenario for Graham Ike is that even if the foul trouble isn't necessarily the problem, he's not contesting enough shots at the rim. Gonzaga's defense has given up easy looks. USC shot 11 of 16 at the rim. Again, that's one example. But the worst case scenario for Gonzaga is that, or for Graham Ike, is that he is unable to help mitigate any mistakes made by the defensive backcourt for the Zags. Gonzaga's guards are not great defenders. There are going to be matchups where guards are getting around Ryan Nembhard, they're getting around Nolan Hickman, and they're getting to the rim. And the worst case scenario is that Graham Ike is not doing anything to stop them from scoring when they want to score in those situations. Graham Ike's high usage rate likely puts him in the all WCC conversation, even in a worst case scenario, barring an injury, of course, but he's not a first teamer. The worst case scenario for Graham Ike is probably still second team, maybe honorable mention if things really don't go well for him this year. But realistically, he's probably still in that mix, but he's nowhere close to contending for Player of the Year. He's nowhere close to contending for All-American. That's the worst case scenario for Graham Ike. Well, folks, believe it or not, Graham Ike's Gonzaga career could extend beyond this upcoming season. We're going to talk about that and his pro prospects, all coming up here in just a second. Right after I tell you folks about FanDuel. Hey, Locked On Zags fans, you can start this season with the big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. Right now, when you get a hunch in the middle of a game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more, all on the same app page where you place your bets. And you get started right now with $200 in bonus bets that's guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. Gonzaga's up to plus 2,000 right now to win the 2025 National Championship. They were at plus 3,000 for a while. That was the best time to get in there, but they're still plus 2,000. Those are still pretty good odds. Go check it out. You got that. You got Wooden Award finalists. You got Gonzaga's odds to win the conference tournament, to make the Final Four, all that and more, all on FanDuel, all on FanDuel's website. So check it out, FanDuel.com, America's #1 sportsbook. All right, folks, closing out the show, continuing our conversation, talking about Graham Ike and his upcoming senior season for the Gonzaga Bulldogs. We're going to talk about his expected role, expected production, and then his future, whether it's in Spokane or not. So expected role for Graham, this is the case with a lot of the players we've discussed because, again, Gonzaga's returning 7 of their 8 leading scorers from last year's team. Michael Ajayi replaces Anton Watson. Caleb Battle adds kind of a new wrinkle to the backcourt. But for the most part, a lot of the players, their role is not going to change a whole lot from what it was last year. And there's not really any reason to expect Graham Ike's role to look all that different. We talked about it a little bit in the best and worst case scenarios, but a big part of what Graham Ike's role could look like this year is whether he's able to play more than 24 minutes per game. And again, we don't know exactly how much of that 24 minutes per game was in part because Gonzaga was trying to be a little bit cautious with Graham Ike coming off of a full season. Not necessarily that he was still hurt. He didn't appear to still be hurt in any way, even early in the year, but just being in game shape is very different than, you can work out for an entire year and a half, close to 2 years really, and still not be in game shape. The best way to get in game shape is to play games. And now that Graham has done that, I think there's less likelihood that he will be held back in any way. But again, a lot of those 24 minutes, a lot of the reason his minutes were at 24 was because he was getting in foul trouble and having to sit for large stretches of games. So the best case scenario for Graham is that he's playing closer to 28 to 30. And I think that's what we're going to see. I think he's going to be 30's probably pushing it, but I think he's going to be closer to 27, 28 minutes per game this year. And then I think, Michael Ajayi comes in. He's a great rebounder. I think the fact that he's a great rebounder and a great floor spacer should help take some pressure off of Ike. Ike doesn't need to be as assertive trying to grab rebounds because Ajayi is an absolute hellraiser on the glass and is going to take some of that pressure off of Ike to be delivering in that area. And it gives him a little bit more room to operate down low because teams were willing to double send Anton's man to double EK and force Anton to shoot threes. Now, he shot 41% from three last year, and that was fantastic, and Gonzaga really needed that, but he pretty much only took super wide open threes. Ajayi is probably going to command more attention on the perimeter than Watson did, which should give Graham more room to operate on the block. However, Gonzaga's perimeter defense is worse with Michael Ajayi replacing Anton Watson. That's not even really an insult on Ajayi as much as that is Anton Watson was one of the best perimeter players defensively that Gonzaga's ever had, especially at his size. So that puts a little bit more pressure on EK defensively as a rim protector. It could result in more players trying to get into Graham EK down on the block, which means he has to be better about going straight up and not committing those fouls that'll get him in situations where he has to sit on the bench. All told, I think the numbers we're going to see from Graham Ike this season are going to look fairly similar to what we saw from him in the last 2/3-ish of his first season in Spokane. About 18 points a game, 7.5 rebounds per game. Maybe he pushes closer to 8 rebounds per game. Again, it kind of depends on the Ajayi factor in that space. I think the 2-point percentage will tick up a bit. I think it'll be a little closer to 65-ish%, and hopefully he's up closer to 1.5 assists. We'll see. We'll see if he's able to improve in that area. I think that's an important part of that. I do think he will win WCC Player of the Year. I'd love to project that he's an All-American. I think that there is again, I said it in the best case scenario, I think there's an outcome where he is an All-American, but there's a lot of really good front court players in college basketball this season. Ryan Kalkbrenner from Creighton, Janai Broom from Auburn, those two guys both feel like as close to locks as you can get for All-Americans in the front court. Hunter Dickinson from Kansas is obviously in that conversation as well. Umar Ballo, former Zag, who is now, of course, at Indiana. Zvonimir Ivasic from Arkansas. Cliff Omoruyi at Alabama. There's others as well, but it's going to be tough for Graham to be in that conversation. I'm not saying it's not possible. I'm just saying I'm more comfortable projecting that he's going to be the WCC Player of the Year than projecting that he's going to be in that All-American conversation. But a big part of Graham Ike's situation right now is that this doesn't necessarily have to be his final year of college basketball if he does not want it to be. Despite having started his college career back in the 2020-21 season, Graham Ike has another year of eligibility after this season. Explain it here very quickly. That first year, the 2020-21 season when he played 12 games, that was the COVID year. That was the year that everybody gets an extra year of eligibility, so we will not count that against Graham Ike and his 4 years that we're gonna say he's got 4 years, and we're saying that does not count as one of them. The 21-22 season for Graham, that one counts. That was his one prolific season at Wyoming, so that's year one. The 22-23 season, he redshirted the entire year, so that does not count. Last year, the 23-24 season for Gonzaga, that's 2. This upcoming season, 24-25, that's 3. And so then the 25-26 season would be his final year of eligibility should he choose to use it. I am assuming that he will not. I do not have any inside information on that. It is just a feeling I have that Graham Ike is not going to be back on a team that will lose Ryan Nembhard, that will lose Nolan Hickman, that will lose Ben Gregg, that will lose Caleb Battle, that will lose Michael Ajayi, guaranteed. Those players are gone, barring an injury suffered very soon by any of those players that takes them out for the season. None of those guys will be back for Gonzaga after this season. Steele Venters is fairly likely to be gone as well, although we don't know. I'm more confident in Steele returning than Graham returning, although I'm not sure on either of them. Steele is just hard to know what his health situation will even be, but the fact that he's never played for Gonzaga, if he is able to return and be healthy and able to step back on the floor, I think he's going to want to do it. Whereas with Graham, if he goes out, he has an awesome year. He wins WCC Player of the Year. He averages 18-8. He might just say, hey, I'm done. I've done what I wanted to do in college basketball. I've got my degree. I'm ready to roll and move on. It's something we don't know at this point. We're not going to know until Graham says anything. He's not going to make an announcement on that anytime soon, so we'll have to wait and see. But it's a question for Gonzaga. The difference between how that 25-26 season looks depends a whole heck of a lot on whether Graham Ike is coming back or not, because Braden Huff and Ismaila Diane, they're both expected to return, but are they ready to take on bigger roles for Gonzaga? We'll see what Huff looks like developing this year. Diane's probably not going to play enough to be in a position to suddenly step into a much bigger role necessarily for Gonzaga. So Graham returning would be a huge benefit for this team. But I'm thinking it's pretty unlikely, but there's nothing confirmed at this point. Last thing here, I always talk about the NBA future for these guys. For Graham, he's an incredibly talented player. But he's just not a fit in the modern NBA. He's just not. He's just not a fit. He Took 19 3-point attempts last year. That's just a non-factor. You can look at his percentage and say, well, 37% is pretty good. It's 19 attempts. It just doesn't matter. It's not moving the needle for him. The modern NBA big needs to be switchable, needs to have lateral mobility to switch on to guards, and ideally a 3-point shot. It's not necessarily a requirement, but it's one. If you don't have that, you absolutely need to have the lateral mobility. Even if you're an elite offensive player around the rim, if you cannot be switchable and you don't have a 3-point shot, you're probably not making it in the NBA. Drew Timme is the best example of this. He is elite at every part of playing basketball except switching defensively and a 3-point shot, and he's not in the NBA. Zach Edey is a counterexample, but he is 7.5 feet tall, so that's a little bit different. Graham Ike is not an NBA caliber defender right now, and he's not a 3-point shooter. So I don't see it for him. He's also an older prospect. He's also got the injury history. So it's just, I don't see that being a future for Graham. I think he'll be a productive pro. If he wants to stay in the States and play in the G League, he'll be able to do that and have success there. He could go overseas and have a very productive career if he wanted to, but I'm not expecting to see him on any draft boards or really in the conversation as an NBA prospect, whether he returns next year or not. It's going to wrap it up for me today here on the Locked On Zags podcast, folks. Thank you so much for making the show your first listen or your first watch of the day. Special shout out to you, everyday listeners. I will be back on Wednesday getting you ready for Gonzaga's scrimmage against NAIA opponent Warner Pacific. Athletic director at Warner Pacific is Ben Gregg's father, Matt Gregg. Fun stories there. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about what we're going to be looking for in that exhibition game. And then we got another one of these player previews, some bold predictions to end the week. And then next week, bam, we're talking Gonzaga Baylor. And it's not an exhibition. That's the real thing. So excited to have college basketball coming back in less than a week. Thanks again for listening, folks. And until next time, as always, go Zags.